good morning, Wayne. How are you?
Good morning, Carlo. I'm great. Up here in the North Woods after a big snowstorm, a couple of days, no power, but I'm glad we're reconnected.
Well, great. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you had a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Very nice. Thank you. Hope you did as well.
Thank you. So today we are honored to welcome Mr. Wayne Abba, architect of Earned Value Management System Reform. Wayne Abba is one of the most influential figures in the evolution of earned value management systems in the United States and internationally. He spent more than a decade in the office of the Secretary of Defense, where he led acquisition reform and transformed the government's approach to program performance measurement. In the early 1990s, he helped replace the outdated cost schedule control system criteria, also known as SCSC, with the more flexible EIA 748 standard, the framework that still underpins EVMS policy today. For this groundbreaking work, he received the David Packard Excellence in Acquisition Award, the highest recognition in DoD acquisition. Wayne's expertise has shaped policy across allied governments, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden, and Japan. He expanded EVM into U.S. civilian agencies through the Office of Management and Budget. He also played a key role in developing the GAO's cost estimating and schedule assessment guides, now standard references for federal oversight and auditing. He served as president of College of Performance Management, supported major programs for the DoD, DOE, and NASA, and contributed to the forums like the NDIA Integrated Program Management Division. Today, he continues to advise government and industry on EVMS policy, best practices, remaining one of the most respected and enduring voices in the field. Thank you, Wayne, for joining us today. So that was a little introduction about what I like to call an EVMS legend. So before we get started in talking about EVMS, I'd like to ask some questions to get to know you a little better. Where did you grow up, and what were some of the key influences that shaped your early life?
Carlo, I grew up where I'm sitting right now, within about 10 miles of here. I was born in the last century, and I'm in a small town called Lawrence, Michigan, and Skainey, where I am right now in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My grandparents moved here many years ago to take advantage of the booming economy that was created by Henry Ford. He needed wood for his automobiles, and he had hundreds of thousands of acres that he bought in the Upper Peninsula. So my grandfather came and worked in the sawmill. My mother graduated from high school here, and I went to school in Lawrence, Michigan, in high school that graduated about 60 kids, I guess. But before then, I actually went to California for a year. My father lived out in Cupertino, which you may recognize as the birthplace of computer technology in the U.S. And I lived out there for a year where I went to a much bigger school that I had the benefit of attending here in Skainey. And when I came back, thanks to that education, I skipped the 8th grade and then graduated in 1963, so I'm dating myself pretty well. I was a member of the Golden Eagles Drum and Bugle Corps, a youth drum and bugle corps sponsored by the American Legion, and I got to travel a lot with them. We went to the national championships in Denver, where we placed 11th in the nation from a small town of 3,000 people. 1962, we won our state championship. And then when I graduated high school, younger than the rest of my class by a year, I was only 17. I joined the Army at that point. I served 4 years in the Army Security Agency, 3 of those in Germany, and I made sergeant and held a high security clearance in the Army Security Agency, which served me well because it sort of set me up for my eventual career in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So I guess some of the influences from those early years, beyond the cliche of having Midwest values, were the discipline, the responsibility from working. I worked in my grandpa's gas station when I was a young lad, competing in the drum corps, serving in the military. And I made some career choices at that young age that served me well later on. I didn't feel I was ready for college at age 17, so I joined the Army instead. And I earned my bachelor's and master's later while I was in civil service. And then living in Germany gave me a really different perspective on the world from age 17 to 20. Just two decades after the end of the World War II, I actually met many people in Germany who served in that conflict.
Well, we certainly have some commonalities. I also skipped grade, the seventh grade, and also joined the Marine Corps at 17 years old, straight out of high school. So we definitely share some great common themes there, and now urban valley management. So great. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. How did you first get into the Army's acquisition and logistics field in the late 60s or in these early 70s?
Well, after I got out of the Army in 1967, I had a friend who referred me to the Army Ammunition Procurement and Supply Agency, APSA, down in Joliet, Illinois. This was the organization that bought all of the Army's small caliber ammunition. So I joined that organization in 67 as a production controller, and worked there until we had a reduction in force. And I became a computer operator based on my Army security agency experience for 2 years. And then I was offered a procurement internship with the Army Materiel Command. So I kind of bounced around in those early years. I trained at the Army Missile Command in Huntsville, where I had a short rotation in the CS Square shop. One thing about that production controller job, I bought all of the small caliber ammunition for the Vietnam conflict from 67 until I finished that job around 1970.
Was there a particular moment when you realized this field would eventually define your career?
Well, not so much that it would define my career, but I got introduced to this idea of earned value management on a rotation through that CS Square organization. We interns didn't know much about it. There was a lot of jargon in that place. We referred to it as the think tank. So I got a basic familiarization with this, but I didn't have any idea that it was actually going to become my life's work. But my next job was in procurement up at the Army Materiel Command headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia in 1975. But there, I walked into another riff. I caught a break. I was loaned to the Army Procurement Policy Office in the Pentagon, where I was a GS-9, a mid-level careerist. I helped clear a backlog of approval actions from all of the Army buying commands, and that was a GS-15 position. So I got a chance to work at a policy level that really helped me understand acquisition policy. And we're getting closer to the EVM piece. Next, I was hired as a contract specialist at MIRADCOM, the Army Mobility Equipment Research and Development Command down on Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And I got my first full-time EVM job at the Army Development and Readiness Command, DARCOM, formerly the Army Materiel Command, as an analyst. And I also served on CS Square review teams there. I then moved back to Belvoir for a couple of years as a procurement analyst in the family of military engineering construction equipment, where I had direct responsibility for reviewing contractors' EVM data and reporting to the leadership. In 1979, I went back to DARCOM as a project management specialist, where I oversaw all of the helicopter and armed vehicle projects. And finally, in 1980, I was hired down in the performance analysis branch in the earned value office at DARCOM. And I worked there directly with a couple of pioneering guys. One was Emil Sten, and the other was Larry Stone, who was one of the original founders of EVM going back to the Whitey Driesnack days. And in that job, I reviewed data on all the Army programs, and I reported regularly to the command group. So that really diverse background gave me a strong foundation for my eventual job in OSD. I knew EVM from all sides, from policy, contracting, reporting, analysis, and oversight. And Larry Stone was fond of saying that, we did this earned value thing, the CS Square thing, as a benevolent way to make sure that industry managed well. And a deputy commanding general at DARCOM told me that was nonsense. He said, we do this so that we have good data to oversee our projects. And, both of those guys were right. But that set up for me an understanding of that dichotomy between reporting and management that really continues to this day.
I did want to ask you, in the early 1980s, when you joined the office of the Secretary of Defense, what was the EVMS environment like at that time?
Well, it wasn't good. In my DARCOM jobs, I caught the attention of the lead guy for EVM over in the Pentagon, Gary Crystal, in the office of the Secretary of Defense. And Gary headed the office that managed the major systems program reporting to the Congress. through the selected acquisition reports and had responsibility for CS Square for EVM. He asked me to apply for a vacancy in his office, and he had a couple of reasons for that besides my EVM. First, I had the contracting experience that added a new dimension. His people were mostly operations research types, so they didn't have that diverse background. But even maybe more important, we went on a field trip together to all of the Army commands. And while we were there, one of the analysts in one of the major program offices actually lied to him about something that was important. And Gary liked the way that I handled that situation from an ethical standpoint. And Gary shared some of the same background I did, in that he came from a small town up in the Dakotas. When Gary first took me to a meeting with NSIA, now the NDIA, National Security Industrial Association, then we walked into what I would have to characterize as an ambush. The audience there just laid into him with hostile questions that had obviously been set up the night before. So if I thought that my OSD role was going to be to go into the office every morning, check and make sure that DoD Instruction 7000.2 was safe and go for coffee, I was wrong.
So what were the key limitations of the original SCSC, and how did you help evolve it into a more effective framework?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Carlo. I didn't think of CS Square as having limitations. It was criteria for guidelines that were supposed to be followed by industry. But I very quickly came to understand that the way it was being done across the services imposed too many requirements. Sitting in OSD, I got the opportunity to work with the Army, Navy, and Air Force and their people who were responsible for reviewing contractor systems and for writing the policy. Those requirements were based not only on their interpretations of the policy and regulation, but also on the preferences that they developed in the course of their experience. And these government people, with rare exception, have never managed anything, but they know how to impose rules. So my contribution to all of that was to rely on my previous experience in contracting and project management and to look for more balance. And there again, that issue remains an important one to this day.
I hear you. So how did you build trust between government and contractors to make EVM a management tool rather than just compliance?
As we left that awful meeting down in Alexandria, a couple of the industry leaders came over and were sort of, tugging on our sleeves and appealing to find a way to improve our communications. And I really took that to heart. As my role evolved, as Gary delegated more and more of the EVM responsibilities to me, I began to establish new ways to communicate with these people. I set up channels to talk with them informally before our periodic meetings with the goal of eliminating those kinds of surprises. I would meet with them at their hotels where they were staying and just get to know one another on a personal basis. And at some point along that line, Gary asked me how I got along so well with people. He was basically a shy guy. And I told him very flippantly that, well, I go out and drink with him, Gary. And the point was that, our professional colleagues are people. And if you relate to them on personal, professional levels and never forget who you are, what your ethics are, then, it changes the environment. So as time went by, that mutual trust grew. The industry people began to confide more stories of things that the military departments were doing, what I called over-implementation. And also, of course, DCMC, Defense Contract Management Command, now agency, was a big player in that. But the industry people often couldn't talk about these things openly because of the contractual concerns. So to work around that, instead of just saying, well, if you can't tell us, we can't do anything, I set up an informal ombudsman function. Our executive signed a memorandum to NSIA, providing for people to provide us with examples, and then we would act on them. And when an issue couldn't be revealed openly, like if it was sole source or whatever, I'd strive to understand and do whatever we could, maybe by talking to the procuring agency. And there were many such, let's call them hallway conversations at conferences that will go unmentioned. but we were able to make things happen. So in later years, the DCMA bureaucracy redefined that ombudsman role, and they made it, instead of something that was designed to improve communications, they made it another excessive process.
Before that happening, were there actually any signs of the contractor behavior, government behavior changing and improving?
Yes, and often on a case-by-case basis. And as these anecdotes accumulated, as we were able to make a change, for example, in an RFP, the word got around. And what really evolved from all of that was trust. And that was on both sides, government and industry. I went through, in my 17 years in the Pentagon, I went through several administration changes with Gary. And as the new leadership came in, the transition teams would talk to the staff about, who around here you should pay attention to. And one of the nice bits of feedback that we got was, well, those guys down there, when they have something to say, you should listen to them.
Great. So your team earned the David Packard Excellence Award in acquisition. What did that recognition mean to you?
Well, it meant a lot to me on a personal level, of course, because we got an outstanding performance rating from the boss. More so, it was the extent of the government and industry people who were involved in that. And it wasn't just DOD. We had people in from other civil agencies. From the very beginning, if this was a good management process that we were responsible for, thought that everybody should be made aware of it and be able to take advantage of it. So you can't do anything on that kind of scale without that kind of broad support. Now, I had backing from my DOD leaders. Like I said, the trust had developed. You listen to these guys. But not all of my industry counterparts had that. They were there in some cases, frankly, because they had to fill that square. They had to fill that compliance square. They had to get that done in order to perform the contract. So our joint team provided safety in numbers. They could speak up candidly and know that they were actually making a difference in DOD policy. When people would come to me with a complaint, I would say, it doesn't do much good to talk to me. Write a letter to my boss. So instead of me trying to tell my boss that there was a problem out there, my boss would come down and say, there's a problem out there, go fix it. Very different way.
Yeah, I see. So let's expand EVM beyond the DoD. So you've worked with allied nations like Canada, the UK, Australia, Sweden, and Japan. What unique challenges did you see in helping them adopt or refine EVM?
That was a very interesting part of my entire career because these people came knocking on our door. They were the ones who came looking for better ways to manage. And one of the first of those was Japan. They had a committee representing their Ministry of Construction that was going around the world looking for better ways of doing business. And they decided that our EVM approach was what they were wanting to do. And that led over the years for me to some 20 trips to Japan, starting officially with the government and then continuing as a consultant and continuing today. I advised Japan as a member of the Graduate School Japan, which was modeled on the Graduate School USA. Graduate School Japan is a nonprofit entity that advises the Japanese government, Ministry of Construction, Ministry of Defense, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and even the Fukushima decommissioning. So what I've learned in that is that this acquisition structure that we take for granted is very different in these other countries. I came to appreciate U.S. policy rested on a foundation of cost sharing for risky contracts. It simply doesn't exist in other places. And that was true of national culture and norms. The Australians came and said, you guys have your well-written policies, but there's a lot that underpins that we had to come to understand. The Australians, when they came to the Pentagon, they were coming off of two acquisition cost disasters. One was the construction of their Parliament House in Canberra, that beautiful building that's mostly underground. That the cost on that building had blown up from $220 million to $1.1 billion. And the Navy ship HMAS Success, ironically, which had gone from near 70 million to near 200 million. Those contracts were renegotiated, but they didn't have the objective cost data that EVM provides. So they put together a parliamentary committee of inquiry, and as with Japan, they found us. So those experiences were very, very informative as we worked with industry in other countries to learn that the vaunted Japanese management system would look to the U.S. Department of Defense for leadership was a revelation for me. And that really helped me understand that what we needed to do was to retain the essence of EVM and work to eliminate those excesses.
Got it. What these international programs, did they get anything right that the U.S. programs struggled with back then?
Well, I only worked hands-on with a couple of those, but yes, they did. One of those was the lead-in fighter Hawk for the Australian Ministry of Defense, Department of Defense. And I was asked to be a member of the Earned Value review team that went over to United Kingdom to review the contractor, GAE. And when I got there, I was working with an Australian officer. What I learned from that experience was that the Australians' approach to teamwork really made a huge difference. And when they first arrived at the contractor's plant, they were fenced off. They had to have strict access controls. The company wanted to know where they were at all times. And as time went by and trust evolved, they broke down those barriers. And they had an agreement that they had signed to follow those strictures. And at some point, they burned the agreement. And they had a sports tournament, and they called it the Ashes Tournament, which celebrated with that. And when the review was complete and everything had been done very, very well, I invited the British Ministry of Defense to come down and attend the outbrief with the approval of the Australians. And at that briefing, the company, in front of their British Ministry of Defense representatives, said that the Australians were the smartest customers they ever had. So yes, what I learned is that the things that we were wanting to do here worked in any environment where openness and trust is the basis of the relationship.
Well, yeah, trust appears is the paramount of success in our industry, right? And so I'm glad to hear that they were able to adapt that type of culture, right, and make things, you know, two-way communication and openness. So that's great. So I want to get into a little bit more on the U.S. civilian agencies. How did you help extend EVM into these civilian agencies through OMB policy?
Well, when I got into the Pentagon, Carlo, there was a lot of mistrust between the executive branch and the overseers and other parts of the government as well. Personal relationships, again, played a major role. I would get telephone calls sometimes from an analyst in the Office of Management and Budget, and I'm trying to avoid naming people here, and I won't in this case for sure. OMB is the parent of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, OFPP, where, the Federal Acquisition Regulation comes from. And these conversations were never productive. The analyst would ask me a gotcha kind of a question, misinterpret my comments to the point that they were just meaningless. And I got kind of tired of that. And I told the boss of the calls, and he agreed that we should just try to stop responding and see what happened. So I did. Nothing happened. And I learned something from that. Sometimes people's apparent authority wasn't real. Well, that opinion lasted until I met a guy named David Musio. I will name him because he's one of the heroes. He was a senior OMB analyst, a retired Air Force guy, and he had heard about what we were doing with earned value reform, and he asked to bring his supervisor to one of the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary meetings that we had in the Pentagon, where we reported to the top leaders. So before you invite somebody from OMB, from the White House complex over to the Pentagon, you want to make sure that the leadership is happy with that. So we talked to the Director of Defense Procurement, and she said, sure, bring them along. She said, as long as we can keep our eyeballs on them, we know they're not doing us any harm. And that led to a really long, productive relationship between the office and OMB, again, built on mutual trust and understanding. David went with me to United Kingdom. He went with me to Japan, and we were doing everything that we could to make these management principles understood and accepted to industry and governments worldwide. 30 years later, that relationship persists, but not to the same level of communication. I'm still in touch with people in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and I'm really thrilled that if something hasn't changed in the last few days, EVM and integrated baseline reviews are still alive in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And the Government Accountability Office was another one. People in the Pentagon said I was naive for being open with GAO because they're auditors. They're there to get you. Karen Ritchie, who had a Navy background, was the person who led the GAO initiative to publish the best practice guides that you mentioned. And after I retired, I stayed in touch with her, and she was the principal author behind the Cost Estimating and Assessment Guide. First issued in 2009, it documented best EVM practices in the context of overall program management. And that review was very, very extensive. I helped Karen edit the guide, and when she asked me for other experts who could contribute, I gave her so many names that the GAO lawyers didn't require an extensive peer review. They said, you've got everybody, which shortened the publication time considerably. The community was very well represented. And I'm proud that I continue to be listed in that guide and the scheduled assessment guide as a significant contributor. I'm really pleased to tell you that the last time I was at the GAO, which was this year, the leadership there assured me that with all the changes going on in government, that their best practice guides aren't going anywhere. They will continue to refine them, and I encourage people to participate in those groups, and I'm happy to help anybody get connected with them that would like to be a member of that. We brought in people from around the world to those groups as well. Most recently, the people in the Association for Project Management who wrote their guide on project controls in 20, and the GAO will use those as references as they continue to refine their guides.
Great. All right. Well, let's talk about a little bit of FAR discussion. So FAR 52.4-4 is being updated to consolidate and simplify EVMS requirements for civilian agencies. From your perspective, what will determine whether this change improves implementation or just shifts the compliance burden?
That's a great question, Carlo. And you know, since I retired, and I've alluded to it several times, the bureaucracy has let us down in returning to a compliance mentality. But there's a couple agencies that have gone in better directions, partly, at least, because I was involved with them. One of those was the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. They'd been on the GAO high risk list for many years, and I was brought in with another consulting company to help to get them removed, and we succeeded in doing that with the late Bob Rovinsky as the leadership of that. And it was the only program that was removed from the high risk list. I also then got to working with the National Science Foundation. I was brought into that effort by a guy named Jack Matthewman, who was the lead scheduler on the Pentagon renovation project. I had helped him with the work breakdown structure and rebuilding the Pentagon after the attack. So I've worked with the NSF for many years, and both OFPP and GAO recognize that the National Science Foundation is today a leader among the civil agencies for the way that they do EVM. And they did that building on the solid foundation that we had left with EIA 748 and the reforms of the 1990s in DoD, OMB, and GAO. So this whole idea of compliance should be replaced by a different ethic, and that's use EVM to help projects succeed, not to count the deficiencies and punish the contractors and withhold their funding. And that's the NSF approach. It's consistent with the best examples of DoD projects during my time, especially the Navy's FA-18EF Super Hornet. That is one of the best examples of EVM ever. And you know, I've seen some things lately kind of criticizing EVM from the standpoint that it's a sclerotic, slow reporting process that gives you information way after the fact. You know, way back when, the FA-18EF used earned value on a weekly basis using labor hours as the metric. So they broke that management versus reporting cycle completely, and they delivered that project on cost, on schedule, full performance.
Great. Great, great. Yes, I've heard you talk about the National Science Foundation example as a great organization that utilizes EVM very effectively. So let's shift a little bit on the IBR's policy shifts and the future of EVMS. Wayne, with FAR updates consolidating IBR language and allowing multiple IBRs through the life cycle of a program, how will these change the role and impact?
As long as they don't become just another EVM review in disguise, I think that repeating them is completely consistent with what we originally intended. The idea was to get people together at the right times to talk about mutual understanding of scope, schedule, and risk. So if they're repeated as and when needed, that's fine. And, one of the things of when IBRs first began, people wanted to make them an event and have pass-fail criteria and all that kind of thing associated with it. The things that bureaucrats do in their comfort zone. And it was far better to consider it as a process. You have the people from the government side that work with their appropriate counterparts as the contractor develops a WBS, for example, and then continue that. And when you're done, you get people together for a celebration event, not for some kind of an in-depth review. So yes, I find the evolution okay, depending on how it's handled.
Got it. So, Wayne, a follow-on question to that. What distinguishes a well-led IBR from one that drifts into a compliance review?
Well, the main point about an IBR, I guess, is the word integrated. EVM is the technique we use to achieve that. When I retired, DoD was in the forefront of well-managed agencies. All this stuff was working, and I have receipts for that. As of the end of April in 2000, the aggregate overrun on all of the 115 largest DoD contracts was 5.5%. That was $3 billion on $85 billion worth of business at 60% complete. And that's adjusted to eliminate the effective over-target baselines. As far as I know, that measure was never continued. But when we started that, the A12, the B2, and the C17 alone accounted for much more than that in terms of overrun. So it was working. And the factors that made it work then, they can make it work again. Leadership by government and industry PMs is really essential. And all the stakeholders need to be at the IBR. And I would say err on the side of inclusion. And the goal is to help the project succeed, not to find fault. And that's the way on the several reviews that I've participated on at the NSF, that's the way they do it. They get together with the project team at inception and at key milestones, and they make advisory comments and they revisit those the next time the teams get together. There's a continuity, a continuum, and it is oriented towards success, not towards punishment.
It's a closed loop system, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you said before that EVMS should be a management tool and not a compliance weapon. But with increasing reliance on corrective action request CARs and payment withholds by cognizant federal agencies, has the system lost its original intent?
Yes, far too often. And I might rephrase that a little bit. I don't think the system lost its original intent. I think it was changed by design. When Gary retired a year after I did, OSD EVM leadership suffered. Industry didn't take advantage of the policy shift that we made by adopting 748, and in the ensuing vacuum or curve, whatever, defense program overruns were back in the news again. And DCMA, under leadership designed to do so, aggressively undid the reforms of the Clinton-Gore era. Gary and I met with people at DCMA around that time, and, we heard one of them say that he was going to get a certain contractor. It sounded more like a personal vendetta than government policy. And EVM certification, again, became a huge problem. And I think by far the worst thing they did was to make EVMS a business system and use it to withhold contract payments.
Well, let's say 748 revision E streamlines the guidelines from 32 to 27, modernizes terminology, and reinforces cost schedule integration, schedule realism, management accountability. From your perspective, Do the updates go far enough to modernize EVMS for today's programs, or does it fall short in addressing current and emerging project management realities?
Yeah, it doesn't go far enough. We count things, we count guidelines, we consolidate them, we nibble around the edges of these policies, but they retain their basic essence. And as EIA 748, as the successor to DoD regulation, it should have retained its ANSI status that it originally had, which it no longer has with SAE as the owners. It would have evolved, preferably as an international standard. That didn't happen. It remained essentially a static document with occasional changes and lost that designation when SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers of all organizations, bought it. I didn't realize that way back when that standards were commodities that were bought and sold, but they are. There's a new publication. I alluded to it earlier, from the Association for Project Management in UK, and it presents EVM in a better way. Project Controls in the 21st Century presents EVM as a natural part of program management. You don't get to it until you get to chapter 31 in the book, followed by a chapter called Performance Measurement, which basically says, if you're not using EVM, how are you managing your project, which is what the NSF does. And these things were developed in parallel, but not in communication with one another. So I was really pleased to see that had come out. And I had the pleasure of introducing the book, which was written as the lead author of it was Paul Kidston, who I've known for several decades. I was really pleased to give a copy of that to the Government Accountability Office and to the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. There's going to be a new best practice guide coming out of GAO for project and program management, and the lead author for that book told me that he will sleep with this book under his pillow. I think that this is the way things ought to go. It's get away from this idea that earned value is something that needs to be superimposed on a project by experts as opposed to something that is built into the framework of the integrated performance management.
Something that improves the process and helps collaboration, right?
Exactly.
All right. So, Wayne, with DFARS raising the EVM thresholds, are we striking the right balance between reducing burden and maintaining disciplined oversight, particularly for mid-range programs below $100 million?
Yeah, thresholds have always been an issue. Back in my day, one of the things I tried to do was to make them adjust with the recognized changes in inflation. And that didn't work. It turned out to be too much for people to do the math, I guess, or something. But thresholds are a problem when they're used arbitrarily. So should a contract be exempted from EVM if its estimated cost is $99,999,000? And I've seen that kind of behavior. I like the NSF solution. They require EVM for the big stuff. Again, for mid-range projects, NSF asks, what will you do if not EVM? And we'll work with the project to find whatever the right balance is. And that project-by-project process can be adapted to the larger agencies. It doesn't have to be the process that we've lived with for all these decades.
So with multiple policy changes hitting in close succession, EIA 748, FAR, DFARS, and Agile guidance, what will help agencies and contractors adapt without losing control?
Well, I don't think there's been any major effort to look at things, really consolidated, well-integrated government industry effort since we did the Clinton-Gore reforms of the 1990s. And I think it's time to do that again, something modeled on that kind of an approach. And, you hit the nail on the head. There are huge changes going on right now. Where's the leadership going to come from? You look at across the agencies, look at the Department of Energy. Probably the top 3 tiers of EVM management gone, right? With the fork in the road choices. So somebody needs to step up. And I think that a good organization to do that would be NDIA. NDIA has played a major role all through the years with the standards and so on, and should step up now. This push for portfolio management, use of commercial practices, it carries a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, failing to apply what we've learned or by continuing these bad practices and ones that make EVM onerous. And, I have to say it. If you walk into somebody's organization and say, we're going to measure you against a 1,000 point scale to measure your EVMS maturity and environment, you're apt to get laughed out of the room.
So we've had discussions find those type of tools in the past, particularly on LinkedIn. And so from I get your point from a punitive standpoint is not good. If you take the punitive aspect of it, I think that the environment assessment is fairly well put together in terms of helping organizations understand what their culture, what their resources, their tools, everything that encompasses EVMS, particularly helps out in understanding where they need to mature, right?
I get that, and I agree. All these things are based on everything that we know, and they're good. And there's at some point there you make the transition from what are they good for, and what you're describing is an environmental culture and a basis of doing things correctly on a broad scale. And what I'm talking about too is a scientist, a Navy pilot, an Army officer coming into a project management job and looking for ways to help them succeed. And there's a difference in the way you approach these people. So the kind of thing that you're describing has great value in a training culture, for example.
Yes.
But if you come in and try to assess a project using these large assessment tools, it's a different world.
Got it. Well, Wayne, if you could influence policy or culture today, what would you do to help recenter EVMS as a proactive decision-making tool, not just a set of audit trails?
Yeah, I think I kind of went there already. Government acquisition organizations and their counterparts in industry should get together much as we did in the 1990s. As I've gone to the NDIA meetings a couple times in the last year or so, and I don't see the government there, and that's a problem. The consistency that we got because of that extraordinary cooperation, and that was not only between government and industry, it was internationally, it was between and among professional associations, between the defense and civil agencies. All that's deteriorated. And I'm disappointed that some key organizations not only failed to maintain those improvements, but worked actively to reverse them. But there are some bright spots. The GAO's best practice guides, again, remain as a touchstone. I go to their meetings. The guides aren't going anywhere. GAO welcomes experts to participate. And again, I can help folks get on distribution. And I know from my work with NSF that both GAO and OMB admire the research infrastructure guides approach to EVM. I've been with them at GAO and seen the reception that Matt Hawkins, for example, who headed the research infrastructure organization at NSF, receives at GAO. Very, very much admired. And for his part, he shares that same philosophy I had in DOD. The GAO isn't your enemy. These are people who can help you identify and apply the best practices to manage your organization. And I would urge people to look at that APM book and consider how EVM should have evolved. I'll provide you that link, and you can include that for folks if you like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I definitely would welcome that. So, Wayne, you've seen EVMS applied well and also go off the rails. Are there any programs or experiences that stand out where it either delivered real value or failed to meet expectations? What lessons should project managers take from those experiences?
Oh, when you told me about the topics that would come up, this is the one that really got me going, because there are so many stories in both categories. I've probably reviewed more EVM information than anybody on the planet. In OSD, I looked at, these quarterly reports, level 1 EVM reports coming in from every major defense program for 17 years. And we had our share of successes and failures, but in both cases, EVM figured prominently regardless of how the program came out. So probably the best example of EVM giving you ample warning but not being paid attention to is the Navy's A-12 Avenger II stealth attack bomber. The Phoenix, if you will, that rose from its ashes, the Super Hornet, from one of the same contractors, stands as a stunning example of EVM done right. In both cases, EVM provided all the information needed for managers to make the right decisions. The difference is how it was implemented and used. For A-12, monthly EVM reporting began months after the contract began. And that tells you on its face there was a lack of effective planning. For the Super Hornet, EVM reporting began at initiation. It was based on weekly status using labor hours. they used EVM to manage, the reports caught up later. And those programs from Navy aviation community should have informed the next big fighter program, the Joint Service F-35 Lightning II, but it didn't. And that, to me, is an indictment of the DoD's inability to learn from failure and success. Unlike the other programs, I'm not privy to the F-35 EVM data, but I'm confident, based on knowledge of the contractor's EVM history, that the data weren't used effectively to inform their program decisions. Another story. One day in the Pentagon, an Army lieutenant colonel came to my office. My assessment of his Defense Acquisition Executive Summary report called into question his EAC, his estimated completion on a cost-type contract. He said he'd been talking to his contractor and looking at the data himself. He said, "You're telling me I'm a bad project manager?" And I said, "No, sir, I'm not. I'm telling you that based on my experience here, if your estimate is right, you're making history." He challenged his contractor, who admitted that my estimate was more realistic. We don't look for precision in estimates. We look for, a range. Are you headed here? Are you headed there? And lacking funding for that higher estimate, he recommended this program be canceled, and it was. I later met him as a full colonel in another job where he'd been promoted, and he thanked me. Showed that that you can, in fact, make these tough decisions. In the case of the A-12, that went completely different. Naval shipbuilding is another one. That's long been a problem area. When our industrial base declined to just a few shipyards specializing in particular ships, the yards accused the Navy of auctioning the ships off, and the Navy accused the yards of buying in, and they were both right. It was happening that way. When the SSN-21 Seawolf class submarine started, I met informally with the program manager, a Navy captain named Dugan Shipway, to discuss his management plan. He had skippered a Los Angeles class attack sub and was the perfect guy for this assignment. And as that program planning evolved, he told me he would drive the WBS down to a really low level. And when I asked him why, what was the cost benefit of that, because it would cost him a lot of money to do, he said he needed to know where the cost drivers were on the first boat in order to lower the cost on the following boats. So when the program was cut just to 3 submarines after the Soviet Union collapsed, Seawolf, Jimmy Carter, and what was the third one? Anyway, he took me to a meeting at the shipyard to adjust the WBS up to a higher level. And the way that he managed that program ended up being praised by the auditors. Another story from internationally. I was at a conference in Australia where I was invited to meet on the way home with the leadership of a company in Sydney that maintained submarines. They were trying to figure out whether they should use EVM on the next overhaul that they had coming in. And after my presentation, their main question was, when the sub comes in, we have some things we know we'll do, but not all. How can we use EVM in an environment like that? And I said, well, include in your WBS an activity to open and inspect, followed by make a plan. And they did that. The next time I was in Australia, the company executive and I were together on a podium, and he took me aside and said that my advice had shaved $60 million off their actual cost. So there's a lesson in all those stories. There's a common element, common thread. And that's for project managers to understand and get involved, and that's it.
I think that there's some signs, some lessons learned that can be taken from past successes and failures. Hopefully, Boeing with the next generation aircraft, is able to learn what helped F-18, Super Hornet succeed, and all the other ones that failed, hopefully stay on target with this one. When EVM was ignored, what were the leadership behaviors you often saw, and what successful PMs consistently do that struggling programs do not?
They get involved. When you get a project manager into a room where you've got all that EVM display set out on the wall, the way we used to do it with papers and thread and stuff like that.
War room.
The war room, exactly. It makes a huge difference. As part of the reform in DoD, we had a huge, the biggest EVM conference ever, I expect. We had over 800 people in the room, and that was because we got the Deputy Secretary of Defense to send a letter out saying that this was an important activity and they needed to be involved. And then at that conference, we had a keynoter from the Pentagon, Don Yaki, and we had a keynoter from Boeing. And we had coordinated the keynotes ahead of time. And the message that Don Yaki sent out at the end of the conference was, if you want to know more about this, he said, get in touch with my staff. Their bags are packed and they're ready to go. And over the next year, I made 44 trips to industry. And the protocol for that was industry paid for the trips. They never sent any money to the Pentagon. They sent me tickets and they paid for the cars directly. All of this very ethical and appropriate within defense regulation and law. And the protocol was that they could have their government representatives in the room or not, depending on which way they preferred to go. So typically they would not. I would go in and talk to the leadership, and that was the quid pro quo. They had to provide senior leadership for these talks, and I would show them what their data looked like when presented to the leadership in the Pentagon. And when I went to Boeing up in Seattle, the VP, who was in charge of the earned value function, sat down with me at lunch afterward with his staff, and he said, he sees more on 2 charts than I see on 7. I want those charts. The irony was that his staff had been trying to push that information uphill to him for years through the bureaucracy without success. Later, their CEO was in the Pentagon for a meeting, and somebody told me he was there, so I went down to the war room to say hello. And when I walked in, he said, Wayne, I wish I'd known you were here. I'd have brought my Abba charts. The story that he told me was that they had taken the EVM data, they had gone out and challenged their commercial programs, and they had found out that of their 7 biggest programs, 2 couldn't even produce such charts. And so they implemented EVM at some level. I don't know how far they went with their commercial programs, but they did that. And again, the message is that top leadership has to understand what you're trying to do, and they can cut through the bureaucracy that fails to make it productive for them. It has to be part of the process. It's people in the environment that they're operating in.
Yeah, I think that leadership buy-in, involvement, CAM accountability, well-informed and trained teams all help collaborate to bring the real information that drives decision-making for good execution, right? So let's hope that folks learn from that and take responsibility of their programs in a different way than some of those that have failed in the past. So I want to take a moment to do some of reflect upon your career, Wayne. You've been instrumental in earned value management for many years, and looking back, what is the accomplishment you are most proud of?
I think it would have to be the contribution to the development of the GAO's best practice guides. Those have stood the test of time now for more than a quarter century, and unlike the executive branch, the GAO has a memory, and it's based on a tremendous amount of data from their own reviews and from their ongoing meetings to continue to update their guides. So their independence and documentation is what we need. And I'm really happy to recognize Karen Ritchie as the person who led that. She is out at the Naval Postgraduate School now, and I think Karen is getting ready to retire. But the legacy that she left with the other analysts who are still up there today, Jennifer Eckert, Jason Lee, Jenny Leota, and the others who continue in her wake, they're doing wonderful work. Those guides are all available on GAO website, and I also recommend that listeners look at the GAO report on EVM reforms from the 1990s. Back in 1997, they issued a report called Major Acquisitions, Significant Changes Underway in DoD's Earned Value Management Process. And if you don't mind, I'll read you an excerpt from that. This is, a quarter century after they wrote this. They said, another challenge Defense Contract Management Command faces, perhaps more subtle than the above reforms, is to better balance the needs of the different communities that depend on earned value information. A common understanding of these basic needs will be instrumental to DCMC's ability to protect each user's basic needs from others' secondary desires. Specifically, as DCMC endeavors to make earned value more responsive to program managers, it will have to guard against basic oversight needs going unmet. We recommend that the Secretary of Defense, 1, promulgate the basic needs of the organizations that depend on earned value information in some manner, such as in the implementing guidance for EVMS, and 2, take steps to ensure that the wants of one organization do not encroach upon the basic needs of other organizations that depend on earned value information as the management of the earned value process transitions to DCMC, and DCMC makes decisions on reforms for the future. In addition, several initiatives relevant to the EV process are ongoing, including electronic data interchange, IBRs, direct access, technical risk assessment, self-certification, and the application of statistical process control techniques to the surveillance process. Some of these are being demonstrated in varying degrees on different programs, while others are still in the policy stage. It is important that DoD ensures that as these initiatives are tested on individual programs, data is captured in a disciplined enough manner to support decisions on what to implement and how. Such data will not only help get the most out of each initiative, but will also make it easier to recognize possible interactions among initiatives. Put in a few different words today, and that caution about these initiatives that are going on remains as relevant today as it was back in 1997.
Got it. So,
today it's artificial intelligence.
yes.
Which will tell us, I remember seeing a variance analysis that said the reason we had a unfavorable cost variance was because we spent more than we planned. Now, AI will tell you that for sure, but you're going to need the people participating in the teamwork to make EVM work the way it should, regardless of the technology supporting it.
Correct. So I know, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago, Pete Hegseth, gave a speech about the accountability for programs, the overruns, the schedule delays, they cannot continue to happen. And so I hope that EVM is the project management tool that is utilized to be able to ensure that these programs are very successful and don't have major delays or are overrunning, as we've seen in the past with some major programs, particularly in times where there is, as your son, the General David Abba, put it together a few years ago, discussing, how the volatility of war across the globe is at high risk. And so I think that it's paramount and very critical that we all take accountability for our programs and help our government be able to build and create these systems that will ensure our national security.
I agree completely. And since you mentioned him, he and I have had many very, very interesting conversations about this. One of the things that happens is that people conflate EVM as a management technique with the bureaucracy that impedes its use. And so there's always the danger of the baby in the bathwater syndrome. So that's, I guess, my biggest caution to come out of all this discussion is to make sure that we remember that we're dealing, regardless of whatever the new technology is that's coming along, we're dealing in a government environment that demands a level of accountability and informed decision-making that differs from the entrepreneurs out there who are spending their own money. And it will always be thus. I've seen these trends come and go. I can remember when in development of a major aircraft program, an officer gave a presentation on Toyota's just-in-time management system and thought that was going to be, to this particular aircraft development challenge, and pointing out to them that when a Toyota breaks down, it pulls over to the side of the road. It is not the same. And people tend to latch on to these silver bullets. And I think that AI can be one of those, and think that it's going to resolve all the management problems, forgetting the basic needs for a level of planning and a level of objective performance measurement and a level of accountability that will always be there in government contracting. And when it fails, then, your program ends up on the front page of the newspapers. Careers are ruined. And for some reason, we don't seem to be able to learn from the programs that do well. We find ourselves dealing with crisis and failure.
Yeah, you would think that with the advent of AI, we could, far outperform, programs from the past that were, had schedules written on the wall instead of, software. And unfortunately, we're regressing in that sort of sense. Yeah. So, Wayne, last question. So, when people look back at your career years from now, what do you hope they will say about your contributions to the profession?
I will hope they say that I made a difference, that ethics and that accountability still matter, and that I guess if I could sum it up, that he done good. He did he did he did right by his career and by his obligations to his profession.
Well, I think you have, Wayne, and you have made tremendous contributions to the profession, the industry, and government acquisition. So I want to take the time to thank you very much for everything you've done for all of us. And I hold you in high regard. And I love running into you. Hopefully, I get to see you maybe at the next NDI in Hurton, Virginia in March. If not, somewhere else, but I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for everything that you've done, for taking the time also to come on the very first podcast of EVMS. And I stole the acronym. So, Elixir Valley Management Systems, I figured, something quirky, something that will get the juices flowing. So again, thanks for everything that you've done. And please, I want to wish you a wonderful holiday together with your loved ones. And please give my best regards to your son, David, the general. I also, another esteemed industry colleague that I hold in high regard and respect very much.
Will do, and I'll look forward to the NDIA meeting. That's back where my family lives, so I have good reason to go. And by that time, I think maybe some of the turmoil in government should have been shaken out, and we can have a better idea where things are going. So I very much look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you, Carlo.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be talking soon.
Thank you.